start moving into Ajahn Sucitto's Mindfulness, Its Friends and Relatives, one more thought occurred to me from the last session with Desmond, your question, and just that when you're experiencing that kind of physical pain that you want to somehow be able to deal with so that you can then move into more of a state of concentration, that really the appropriate object of meditation at that time becomes the resistance to the pain, the wishing it weren't there. So you can make that the actual object of contemplation, the object, rather than trying to go to the breath or, to some sort of standard meditation object, you go to the actual, what's this like? I'm experiencing something that I don't want to experience because it feels to me like it's impeding my ability to concentrate. So you go to that actual experience of having to experience something you don't want, and just to explore that and say, well, what's the truth here? The truth is that I really don't want this. What's that like? And to develop that kind of open spaciousness towards having to be with something you don't want to be with, that in itself is the contemplation, the object. And if you can open your heart, open your mind, and expand your mind to include that which you don't want, it's still there. But if you can open your mind to include that and let it be part of your experience, that's samadhi. That's your concentration. It's that expansive, encompassing, inclusive state of mind that can make room for even the unwanted. It's just kind of another thought that came in. You don't have to pigeonhole or force samadhi into a certain kind of experience that is based on the absence of something you can't control.
Just wondering, so sometimes like if you have a very narrow focus and on a particular meditating object, and sometimes pain comes up, and all that narrow focus energy will suddenly be drawn to the pain.
Yeah.
Maybe is that why the pain just suddenly feel more intense, and if there's no spaciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's an unfortunate, sometimes, opinion or, view on meditation that it is this very narrow, pinpointed focus of intensity. Because that's what the word concentration, that's how we use it in the Western world. That's why concentration isn't really such a good example, because samadhi is anything but narrow. Sometimes we have to narrow our focus a little bit if the attention is going to unskillful objects. Sometimes we have to narrow our attention a bit to not go there, to the unwholesome states of mind. We have to narrow our attention to a specific wholesome factor. But samadhi itself is a very broad state of mind, very broad state of awareness.
So when people say you were, trying to have a full body mindfulness, so the body is not necessarily narrow, but it's
circumscribed. So that it's not kind of like, so that your attention isn't just kind of like wandering off into, spaciness or driftiness, completely unfocused. It's just that the focus is broader. It's not a narrow focus. It's still focused. And attention is contained. It's contained to the limits of the wholesome object, though. It's just so it doesn't expand into unwholesome areas, like thoughts of the future, thoughts of the past, old stories, old experiences that, just one can proliferate on. One doesn't allow oneself to expand to get lost in those kinds of things. But it doesn't mean that one is so narrow and tight that one is like excluding a sense of, broad well-being. I think we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm just going to move more into the mindfulness, its friends and relatives, read some excerpts excerpts from this and kind of comment along the way, probably a little bit here and there. So by Ajahn Sucitto, Mindfulness, Its Friends and Relatives. What does mindfulness mean? The term mindfulness, sati, has become a buzzword in recent years. We hear of mindfulness being used in many ways to increase calm, to rectify attention disorders, and to offer emotional stability. It is employed in a number of ways: mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, mindfulness-based childbirth, mindfulness for sports people, mindfulness for businessmen, and mindfulness in the military. A calm, collected emotional state and a clear present moment attention can have many applications to improve how a human being functions. And mindfulness is commonly understood to provide just that. In terms of its popularity, in the West at least, it has outgrown and often doesn't even acknowledge its ancient Buddhist parent with all her religious mannerisms. But what is mindfulness? Is it a technique of noting, a moment at a time, phenomena that arise within an unwaveringly focused attention? Finding the rigor of this approach too rigid and stressful, some teachers have espoused a less object-oriented approach of tuning into awareness itself, an approach that is backed up in Tibetan Dzogchen practice or in Advaita Vedanta, but which finds less secure ground in the Pali texts of the Theravada. So this can be confusing for people who are approaching mindfulness through the Pali canon. One problem seems to be that of taking the method through which mindfulness is applied microscopically, a method taught by acknowledged masters, such as the Mahasi Sayadaw and Sayadaw U Pandita, and a foundation for Goenka and Western Vipassana teachers, to be mindfulness itself. But to swing the other way, and to say that mindfulness is just about being aware in the present, seems to miss a salient feature of what the texts and the practice are about. Mindfulness entails more than being choicelessly aware in the present moment. So I think that kind of touches on some of the things that we've already started to point to, that the way it's been picked up is so varied, not only in popular culture, but also even in methods of meditation, and that certain methodologies that take it to this narrow focus seem to, for many people, produce this very constricted, very constricted state of mind that becomes quite tense. Not that some people, as he mentioned, have used it to great benefit, but that seems to be a result often when many of us take that kind of very microscopic, rigid, focus, exclusionary kind of approach to the practice. The other extreme being that kind of what is termed choiceless awareness. Oh, I'll just, be here and be aware of everything that arises and passes away, without any kind of quality of focused attention on wholesome, unwholesome, and some sort of containment. Sort of Ajahn Pasano's word for that is meditating on nebulous nothingness, which doesn't really get you very far either, except kind of maybe a pleasant, spaced out, drifty kind of quality. Good for sleep. So it's saying, it's not either of those two kind of ways that we've seen it being approached. Reference to an object in and of itself is part of what mindfulness offers. But in mindfulness as a factor for liberation, there is more to it than that. The texts present mindfulness as being accompanied by other factors. I call them friends and relatives. For instance, take mindfulness in the Eightfold Path. It's only one factor of an unfolding process which begins with right view and leads on through right speech and right action, through right mindfulness and into samadhi. The most important factor is right view, the wise perspective that reminds us that everything we say, do, or even think has results for good or bad. So we can't ignore the actual moral tone of what it is that we're bringing mindfulness to or focusing our attention on and bringing into the heart. It has there's a moral quality that comes along with whatever it is that we bring in for consideration. And as I was saying before, that like samma sati, the samma implies that all 8 factors of the path are working together. So to be right mindfulness, you also have to be engaging with right action, right morality, right speech, right livelihood, and as he says here, right view, the knowledge, essentially, that the whole purpose of all of this is to understand the Four Noble Truths, the fact that there is suffering, that there is a cause of suffering, which is, attachment, clinging, craving, and that there is a possibility for the release, and there's a path to doing that. So that has to be all in the context of the practice of right mindfulness for it to be right mindfulness. Then in terms of attention, there are teachings such as, when your virtue is well purified and your view is straight, based upon virtue, established upon virtue, you should develop the 4 establishments of mindfulness. Just back step for a minute, and he says this a little bit later, but attention, the Pali word is manasikara, attention. And there can either be yoniso manasikara, which is wise or appropriate attention, or ayoniso manasikara, which is unwise or inappropriate attention, depending on the quality of mind that attention on that particular object brings up. It's either appropriate or inappropriate, wise or unwise. So manasikara. The act of paying attention is qualified. This instruction isn't about merely noting an object. The requirement to establish virtue and awareness of the causes and effects of one's actions indicate that in Dhamma practice, it's not enough to notice that one's body is doing something and sensations are arising, but how and why. Robbing a bank or slaughtering a chicken might require clarity, focus, and calm, but they wouldn't be themes for right mindfulness. Parentheses, although there is such a thing as wrong mindfulness, miccha sati. Because they don't reveal the accompanying mental quality, in this case, the qualities of avarice, shamelessness, and harmfulness. So, for right mindfulness, the attentive aspect of mind has to connect with a felt awareness of one's approach and intention. This is because, taken on its own, attention is amoral. Assassins can cultivate it to a high degree. But attention is not mindfulness. Attention, manasikara, is the aspect of mind that is operated through manas, M-A-N-A-S, manas, mind as a rational object-defining tool. This is the function that gets tuned to high degrees of efficiency and speed. People racing through piles of data, people rapidly trading stocks and shares, people behind screens, scanning and taking notes, have high degrees of attention and rapid reference. But what they're not referring to is their own awareness, mind as heart or citta. So, difference between citta and manas. Citta is the mind of feelings and impressions and of how I am. Mind is an empathic awareness. It's the all-important focus of mindfulness, because if it is steadied and cleared of wrong views and unknowing, there is liberation. So citta is what is liberated. Manas is not liberated. Citta is what is liberated. So mindfulness refers the objects of attention to this mental awareness or heart, to know what it is being affected by and how that affect arises and passes. This knowledge is called clear comprehension or full knowing, sampajanya. It is a vital relative of mindfulness, one that gives it a crucial role in mind cultivation and, in fact, in our well-being. Through lack of the knowing that arises through mindful reference to citta, people lose themselves in what grabs attention or get stressed out. In both cases, they lose full contact with their awareness, even to the extent of not knowing that in that a steady basis is available. So when there's this lack of clear understanding, sampajanya, anya means knowing, pajanati means direct knowing, so it's a kind of a superlative to knowing. There's just knowing, but then there's direct knowing, pajanati. Sampajanya is adding even a stronger qualifier to it that makes it like really super duper clear, direct knowing. So it's, and when that is lacking, then, it's the defilements that take over, the underlying tendencies towards wanting, aversion, confusion, anxiety, fear, all of these conditioned underlying tendencies that come from who knows what causes and conditions in the past, that, those underlying states of mind that we would consider obstructive. When there's no sampajanya, when there's no clear, super duper direct knowing of the mind and its states, then we get lost and the defilements take over and they control the whole movie. They're the producer, director, actor, the whole thing. And that's when we start to do things that cause us even more suffering. That's why right mindfulness is vital. If there's one life-saving feature that I'd say mindfulness is about, is that it connects manas, the object definer, to citta, awareness, the subjective sense. Mindfulness is there in the moment of holding the question, how am I with this? If we liken the mind to a hand, attention is like the fingers, and citta is like the palm. Fingers can probe, twiddle, and touch, but are unable to collect anything. They can go out and move and focus and hold, put themselves there, but they're not holding it. The palm itself can't probe and inquire, but it receives, collects, and fully feels what the fingers place in it. So citta, or mind, has a storekeeper's wisdom. It wants to know what is worth being in touch with, what can be held for one's welfare. It certainly needs educating, and that is the function of deep or wise attention, yoniso manasikara, the attention that selects which sense data mindfulness should bear in mind. There's a huge amount of stuff that the mind can potentially linger in or get lost in, so deep attention is another friend of mindfulness. It requires skillful intention and clarifies what you're experiencing. Deep attention means that rather than note every thought that runs through your head, you get to the point. What is the overall trend here in one word? Restlessness, anxiety, irritation, friendliness? Then mindfulness bears that mind state in mind, lets it sit in awareness. So when right view and deep attention guide mindfulness, it draws manas and citta together. You know where your actions and thoughts are coming from. You're ethically attuned. So just a kind of a little thought there also about sampajanya, that, that, as I was saying before with the derivation of the word into pajanati, the clear there's this clear knowing, sampajanya, that of the object that you're focusing on as it is, without value judgment, without opinions about. It's just that clear knowing of that object without perceptual distortion. So like if you're using the body parts as the four elements or the anatomical parts, or just the somatic experience that we talked about before also, you're drawing that you're using your attention to focus on those particular objects, drawing it into the heart with the awareness and the knowing of whether you're holding it in some skillful or unskillful way. So if you're drawing a contemplation of the body, you're focusing on that as your object, you're drawing into the heart, you're also evaluating it in terms of, am I regarding this body as I do habitually? Are the defilements in control and judging it as to whether it's beautiful or unbeautiful or healthy or unhealthy or the way I want it to be or the way I don't want it to be? Or is it holding it, with clarity and equanimity, using the body as an ethical basis for action, non-harming. So it's knowing all of those various aspects of the object that it is that we're pulling into the heart for awareness, into the mind for awareness, weighing it against all of those skillful, unskillful, wholesome, unwholesome, useful, unuseful ways of regarding it. That's how Sampajanya moderates our mindfulness practice and brings it to close to a state of discernment, of wisdom. So this reference and the full knowing that it supports opens and clarifies the heart. As the various reactions and distractions die down, the fingers of attention and the palm of awareness can meet with no aim and object other than that meeting. Then you have samadhi. The mind is unified. Through mindfulness, attention comes home to awareness, and finding that this is a very comfortable place to be, intention settles into appreciation and ease. Of greater significance in the long run, mindfulness is involved with wisdom. It may be correct to say that mindfulness is non-judgmental, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't support assessment. It is in the putting aside self-judgments and short-term impulses that an assessment of what is really useful can take place. So it's non-judgmental in the sense that, there's going to be certain memories and perceptions and experiences that pop into our mind, and some of them may not be very skillful. They may be old habits. And to that extent, we don't criticize them or blame ourselves. We don't add a layer of guilt onto it. We recognize what they are, and we realize the moral quality, though, that they may be not skillful and that they're going to lead to harm to ourselves or others. But we don't berate ourselves. We don't add self-hatred to it. That's what we mean by non-judgmental awareness. It doesn't mean that we're not discerning and that we don't realize that there's some consequence if we actually grab a hold of those unskillful perceptions and use them. But we notice that they're there. We realize that they're there out of past conditioning, and we don't pick up on them. We just let them be, and we don't act on them. So there's that kind of non-judgmentalness, but there is a lot of discernment and judgment, a sense of how to pick it up and use it. It still applies. So part of the wisdom faculty, wisdom doesn't mean, panya just doesn't mean like contemplating anicca, dukkha, and anatta, although that certainly can be part of the wisdom contemplations, but it's also a broader sense of investigation and discernment based on knowing what's harmful, unharmful, wholesome, unwholesome. Is part of also the second factor of enlightenment, Dhammavichaya, investigation of qualities, investigation of Dhammas. So, and he's referring to this, and I'm skipping over to this next part. This is investigation of qualities, or Dhammavichaya. Dhammavichaya has to be applied to the citta, as in, what effect is this having on my mind? Or, what is there at the periphery of attention? sometimes through tunnel vision, we miss the most important messages that citta is telling us, like, I'm pinched and pressurized, or it's time to just enjoy this. Like in a state of calm, peace, through meditative practice, the mind is starting to settle down. Sometimes you can see the mind get up and say, okay, well, I'm not supposed to get attached to pleasure of meditation. I need to get down to investigation, because that's really where the freedom is found, is in mindful investigation. It's not in, sinking into and getting lost in pleasurable states. Sometimes that's taking it a bit too far. Sometimes we actually need to just enjoy the peacefulness and the bliss that comes from a skillful kind of meditation. That's kind of the carrot that we hold for ourselves in this practice. If we didn't have that kind of appreciation and pleasure for what meditation can bring, and to be able to sink into it, absorb into it, and enjoy it. If we didn't have that, we'd be just kind of looking for pleasure in the normal ways through more unskillful ways that lead to only a short-term sense of happiness. So we can allow some absorption and enjoyment of the pleasure from samadhi. The spirit of investigation encourages us to assess the mind at any time. For example, can my mind find focus on this aspect of breathing, or does it settle more readily while walking? Or is this the time when kindness is a more suitable place in which to dwell? Through investigation, the corruptions of forcefulness, ambition, or our ideas about what we should be experiencing get weeded out. They are replaced by a more subtle invitation into truth. In this way, citta educates manas in the ways of directly experienced wisdom. In other words, that sense of evaluating and knowing the effect in the heart, what's happening inside. Is it skillful or is it unskillful? What I'm focusing on, that then informs where we want to put our attention through manas. It says, oh, okay, well, actually I'm getting a bit contracted, I'm getting a bit stale, I'm getting a bit drowsy. Maybe where my attention is being focused right now is not appropriate. Switch it and do something else that is more appropriate. So citta, as he says here, citta educates manas. And manas pays back by casting that wisdom into concepts that form the storehouse of one's contemplative know-how. In other words, once we've realized a certain approach is useful, we can actually consciously turn it into a conceptual thought that we can then use to reflect on at a later time to bring back that state of mind, to bring back that focus of attention. So it's not that thinking is completely useless. It's just that proliferative thinking based on unclear states of mind or obstructed, defiled states of mind. That generally tends to be pretty useless. But that conceptualization does have a part in Dhamma practice in terms of helping us to really understand on a conceptual level, verbalize, and use as a tool to bring us back if we need to. And just, he doesn't mention it so much here, but in my own reflection, just that also that Dhammavichaya, that investigation of qualities, then does extend to the qualities of investigation around things like the Four Noble Truths. There is dukkha, is what is happening in my experience now, part of the second arrow of the dukkha that we can control. How can I understand that and maybe let that go? Through realizing and investigating and asking myself, okay, is there clinging here? Am I holding on to something that I don't need to be holding on to? Is there a grasping tendency? Just asking ourselves those questions. Noticing, directing our minds through investigation and wisdom in the heart, well, what is this process of arising and ceasing of the different experiences that I'm having, mind or body? And like as we did in the first contemplation, the first guided meditation, really directing our attention to the quality of uncontrollability, the quality of anatta, the fact that mind and body are really conditioned, self-perpetuating entities when there's the presence of greed, hatred, delusion. And that when those are cleared, then that sense of narrow-gripped me, self, relaxes and lets go. We let go of that grip, that perception. So this is, the most skillful use of investigation and wisdom to develop that insight that then leads us to a sense of relinquishment, letting go of that clinging, of that attachment that is the basis for suffering. So, any questions now? I have a time here for a few more questions if something's popped up, for clarification or...
I noticed that early Buddhism uses a lot of metaphors from nature. You yourself mentioned the hand and the palm and the fingers. Yet at the same time, some of these teachings or some of these points of view say that we don't use nature, we don't use our mind like an assassin would, for example, the attention of mindfulness.
Can you say that part again? I didn't quite catch that.
Well, okay, mind is mind, right? So we start from the point of view that everyone has a mind. This attention can be used for work, for stock trading, for example.
For?
Stock trades.
Oh, yeah, uh-huh.
Right, you mentioned stock trading.
Right.
For stock trading.
Right.
And also be used for hunting, whether it's animals or whether it's people. It can be used for a variety of other endeavors. Now, it can also be turned inward to study ourselves, basically to study our bodies, our emotions, our feelings. So, but, okay, the first are worldly uses, let's say. Second one is a religious use. But I don't see a difference. Religion is religion, stock trading is stock trading. They're just activities that the mind does. I don't know that it's. I don't think it's. Well, I'm not sure the conclusion that the religious activity is somehow superior to the world activity.
The benchmark that we're using and that the Buddha was pointing to is the benchmark of what leads to suffering, or what leads to more suffering, or what leads to less suffering. And in the context of that, say, an activity that supports harm or supports greed or desire or wanting or acquisition or that kind of thing generally will lead to, in the end, some more kind of suffering, either for ourselves or for other beings. Something, in the terms you used, religious, activity or spiritual practice, paying attention to the moral effect of what we're doing and where it leads to in terms of long-term well-being, long-term happiness, as opposed to short-term gain or short-term happiness, then one could say that is more skillful because it's leading to a more firm, strong basis for continued happiness, one that is less dependent on external circumstances, which are always changing. Fortunes rise, fortunes go away, fortune sees the stock market goes up, the stock market goes down. And if that's where you're focusing most of your attention and placing your hope for well-being, then the amount of suffering and well-being that you experience is going to go up with the stock market and down with the stock market. But the spiritual qualities that we're talking about putting our attention on and developing and focusing on are much more stable, long-term, even kinds of things. And they're not so dependent on the external world and what happens, in the external world. They're more dependent on just a gradually developing sense of stability inside of ourselves, an internal reference point that we can go to that gives us a longer-term sense of stability and well-being. So it just depends on what you define as, what you want from life, essentially. If you want a more stable place of refuge where you can put your attention and be at peace, internal peace of mind, then at least it's the Buddha's supposition, and certainly my experience, that those what we would call the mental qualities or the spiritual qualities are a much more simple, peaceful, and dependable place for resting, for attention. Yeah. Yeah.
I've heard it say before that the feeling of conscience or hiriotaka is wholesome, even though it might be unpleasant. But then, it's not exactly those words per se, but that it's useful in the sense that you're being directed to something unskillful that happened in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But then, but then I feel like it's kind of, for me at least, it kind of morphs into sort of like a guilt or worry thing. So I try to think about okay, just be clear about what I did wrong,
Mm-hmm.
and then acknowledge it, and then say it out loud if I need to, and then
do what?
say it out loud if
Yeah.
I need to,
Mm-hmm.
and then move on. But then, is that a good way of dealing with it? I mean, it seems like it's also that approach is also seems kind of mental sometimes. Is that kind of too categorical in a way? So maybe using more metta or something like that might be good as well sometimes. Do you have any suggestions?
All of the above, really, in a sense. That, there's that teaching that I often reflect on and refer to from the Samyutta Nikaya, the conch trumpet blower. You probably remember that one, where it's kind of a long sutta with different angles to it, but essentially, basically a person is lamenting to the Buddha that he has committed all of these offenses against the 5 precepts, and by virtue of that, his understanding is that he's going to suffer and go to hell for all of these breaches of the 5 precepts. And it's kind of getting into it, lamenting and saying that, this is inevitable. This is what's going to happen because this is what my teacher told me. You break these precepts, that's it. And the Buddha more or less says, well, if you hold that view and you believe that and you rehash that and you bring that up and you reinforce that view that, yes, I committed all of these offenses, I did all these things that were harmful, and therefore I'm going to really suffer for it in terms of my rebirth, then yeah, that's probably what's going to happen, But, the skillful approach is what you started to describe, which is where you acknowledge them and you don't pretend that they didn't happen. And you realize, what's been done has been done. I can't undo it. I can't make it so that it didn't happen. And I know that it's going to have some effect somewhere. But what I can do, and I can't do anything about, can't do anything about the fact that it's going to have some effect in some way. I don't know what it's going to be. But what I can do is acknowledge the wrongdoing, resolve not to do it again as best as possible. Say, okay, well, I can do better than that, So I'll try and be more aware when this circumstance arises or when I say something that could be harmful, just try and slowly develop my skills in seeing that and catching it before it happens. That's what ottappa is part. That's the ottappa part, the catching it, the trying to prevent it from happening out of concern for others. And that's where I leave it. I don't move into mental proliferation, the guilt, the revisiting, the application of self-blame, self-flagellation, self-criticism that then turns up the papancha mill. And then he says, not only that, but start practicing the 4 Brahma Viharas. So yes, practicing metta, practicing compassion, joy and equanimity, you should do those also, but you don't do those necessarily as a, response to try and get away from, the precept or the harmfulness or whatever it is. It's like you still have to acknowledge that and kind of allow that to register in the heart, but only as the effect of the action, not as a further punishment to then somehow expiate the sin. Confession is good. We do it all the time in the monastic room, just to get it out there, make it so that it's not hiding in the recesses as a suppressed or repressed memory of some unskillful thing. But so you put it out there, and then you leave it. And additionally, in not necessarily even strict association with that particular event or for that particular reason, you cultivate the qualities of metta and karuna. Because just as I was talking about before, those are the expansive states of mind, so that when the karmic effect of that past action does have its reaction, you're not tasting, a big mouthful of salt. You're maybe experiencing it a little bit, or as the Buddha says, a trifling experience in this vast state, this expanded state of kindness and compassion. The same effect, but experienced in a mind that is quite able to hold it as part of a greater experience.
So it's kind of a phrase is that sometimes I think of it as like, I'm better than that. I'm better than that action that I did in the past. Like I can do better than that. Sort of a personalizing way of doing it, using that phrase skillfully, with the I am's phrase, because it's easy to say I am that, or I am not that, or I am better than that, but it's sort of like more like just using it as a colloquialism. That's fine, but it's basically saying, that's not who I am. I'm not that bad act. I'm not someone who did that bad act. It was an unskillful action, and I'll feel some results from it. What's done is done. There's also the ability to train the mind to go in a more skillful direction, one that leads to less regret, less harm. And that is by restraining oneself from those kinds of unskillful actions and cultivating those, expansive, lovely states of mind. Yeah. Yeah, and all of this, I think, just keeps pointing back to we use our focused attention in the present moment for the ends of developing, wholesome, peaceful qualities in the heart. They have to refer back and forth to each other. What we choose to put our attention on and the effect that it actually has towards a longer term stability of happiness and peace in the heart itself, in the mind itself. Working back and forth. You can see it's a very
active process. It's not just to sit back and still the mind and just let it, everything arise and pass away. There's a lot of getting in there and, reflecting that is very, very useful and very calming and peaceful. It's not like unpleasant work. Okay, well, let's maybe have another period of meditation, slightly different theme. So find that position of comfort and ease, but not too comfortable and easeful that you nod off. Maybe we've talked about this some already, but a little bit more in terms of a meditation, talking a little bit about the second Satipatthana, Vedana, feeling tone, which I've kind of defined already. But before we move into that, just to get settled back into the experience of the body as your basis, firm foundation. So I won't talk so much this first maybe 10 minutes or so, but just to use this first bit of time here to really ground oneself back into the somatic experience, the whole body, breathing, settling. Usually best experienced by scanning through or attending to the whole body first, and letting the breath, letting the breathing come to you rather than you having to go search it out and pin it down and, sit on it, let it come and find you, and then rest in your awareness, the breathing in and out. So just establish that full sense of body presence first, and then slowly let the breathing come and find you. So continuing just to sit where you are and stay present with the bodily experience. And turn our attention to the realm of Vedana, feeling tone, as in the second establishing of mindfulness. As I mentioned before, the feeling tone in any moment of contact experience, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And the goal of this contemplation is to actually be able to apply it in our waking moment activities throughout the day, so that we gradually become more attuned to when something pleasant is happening, how the mind reacts, where does it go? Or when something unpleasant is happening, how does the mind react, where does it go? Right in that moment of experience. In this exercise, we'll be sort of manufacturing a memory or a projection of the experience itself in the mind, just to use as a way to sharpen our abilities to see it when it really happens in the present moment daily life experience. So just as a mental exercise, bringing up a memory of some pleasant sensory experience, or a projection of, based on the past, of what it's like to experience some enjoyment through a sense base. So, easy one to conjure up is the experience of eating or food. What happens when one is hungry and eats something that has a very pleasant taste to it, something that's desirable based on your own preferences? Your favorite food. So just imagine, that for a minute. Allow yourself to indulge, if you will, in that fantasy or that memory or that projection into the future of what it'll be like when I get this. That sense of pleasant taste, pleasant feeling, sensation in the body. And then maybe just to contemplate what actually happens in the moment of that experience. There is that kind of rush of pleasant feeling. The first bite. Second bite, probably still some pleasant, good amount of pleasant feeling. Maybe not quite as much as the first bite. Another bite, still pleasant, a little bit less. And then so on, mouthful after mouthful. And suppose you have the opportunity to have as much as you want. Just take it to its logical conclusion. You follow that impulse. Have some more, have some more, have some more, have some more. Diminishing returns. At some point, you don't want any more. All of a sudden, what was pleasant becomes unpleasant if you were forced to keep doing it, to keep eating it. So you stop. There's some satisfaction, feeling of being replete. And then what? maybe there's a period of time where you just got to do your task, got to get up and wash the dishes, do some other thing. And then that desire, mind, starts to search for something else, usually. Maybe not something to eat, but some other way to satisfy the urge for something pleasant. Go find some recreational pastime, watch TV, go read a book, do something else that brings a sense of pleasure. Until that has had its time, you put it down. Then desire comes up again to go somewhere else. That's just the nature of desire. So this is what the underlying tendency towards pleasant experience is all about. The underlying tendency is the ignition, temporarily satisfied, but only temporarily, of desire. It doesn't go away for long anyway, through just gratifying the desire itself, that in that temporary moment. The underlying tendency is still there. So the reflection that the Buddha suggests is to really regard these sensory experiences in terms of what do we need for the basic requisites. Food for satisfying hunger and being able to have a healthy body, and all the other requisites similarly. But to use it just as a tool, not to gratify unrelenting desire, but as a tool for practical experience of practicing the holy life. So the trick is in this feeling or in this contemplation of feeling, when it's a pleasant kind of experience, how far do you need to take it? And having that kind of boundary, mental boundary of what do I need, rather than how can I increase my pleasurable sensory experience? What do I need? And that's taking the mind that is focusing on that object of pleasant experience, it's taking it into the heart, seeing where it leads with wise reflection. So that we gradually learn not to let desire and craving, tanha, be the master of our attention, be the master of our mind. But it takes that ability in the moment not to get lost. That's where this remembering quality of mindfulness is important. We develop that faculty of remembering where to put our attention. We put our attention on the pleasantness of this experience and how far we're letting it control us. That's what we're remembering. That's what we're mindful of. Similarly, with unpleasant feeling, maybe bring up a memory of a difficult interaction or interactions person with whom there's been painful experience. And, within reasonable bounds of bringing that memory up, so as not to completely torture yourself, but just to bring up that experience. What was that interaction like? Remember it. And see the story, hear the words, and feel the effect. So rather than continuing to think about and visualize and hear the words, make a conscious intention to drop the story and move wholly into the experience that you feel in the body. Just the feeling tone in the body of unpleasantness. Where do you feel it in the body? Is there a lump in the heart, or clenching in the jaw or the throat? Tightness in the stomach? Where do you feel it? And dropping the storyline. And just if it's not unbearable, just be aware of the body, where there's obstruction or tension in relation to this, and allow the breathing to be with it. Not to try and push it away, but just to try and say, okay, can I open to this unpleasant feeling? And just breathe with it. Allow it to be there for as long as it's going to be there. With all the patience in the world. And don't be afraid to touch that pain. If it's really intense, maybe don't go directly into it, but keep a respectful distance, but on the edges, the boundaries of it, so that you're not pushing it away. But maybe just hovering around the edges if it's particularly difficult. If it's a mild one, just be with it as fully as possible as you breathe in and out. And regard that actual physical sensation with a kind intent of, I'll just be with this. It's okay. And soften to it. And with practice, with this kind of approach to painful feeling, gradually we learn how to move more readily into that space of acceptance and gentle regard rather than aversion or resistance. And remembering it does take sometimes a bit of firm diversion of the story, dropping the story, so that we don't just keep reliving the words and the visual image. So, in just contemplating feeling tones, Buddha talks about feelings, Vedana, it's like bubbles in a pool of water that's where rain is falling. The raindrops hit the pool of water, bubble pops up and pops, bubble rises, pops up, one after another after another. And that's akin to how pleasant feelings arise and pass away, painful feelings arise and pass away. Often very quickly, one replacing the other, one changing into the other. Painful feeling arises. When it passes away, it becomes pleasant. Pleasant feeling arises. When it departs, it's unpleasant. One after another. And you can actually experience that if you tune into that quality. It's the attachment or resistance to either of those that actually cause the suffering. And if we see that clearly, then equanimity comes into play. And we feel the feeling, we feel the pleasant, we feel the unpleasant. And we're just with it as it arises and it passes away and changes. And if we establish that sense of equanimity, then that's a much more stable frame of reference than running after the pleasant or running away from the unpleasant. We really develop, encourage, expand into a very spacious state of equanimity that knows and is aware of the arising and passing and just doesn't pick it up. So, getting close to ending, it's 4:25, and just a bit of a walkthrough, at least for the first two establishments of the four establishings of mindfulness. And as you can see, that this could be, we've got a whole two other mind and certain mental qualities that warrant much exploration along the same lines. But just to give you a sense of the powerfulness of this as a tool for developing both calm, peacefulness, samadhi, and insight, wisdom into the nature of our experience. Any final questions, last minute needs for clarification or thoughts?
I found the last exercise kind of difficult to expand enough to accept it, and just to maybe really kept wanting to nag and bite.
Yeah.
And then I started thinking, well, it's probably going to happen again, and I need that like really.
You picked a potent one.
Pardon?
You picked a potent one.
Well, you mean thoughts like that?
Yeah. You were able to find one that really could get its teeth into you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the idea is to sit with it, to feel it physically, and be able to encompass that, find room in your heart for that.
With wisdom, so that you know that if you're getting completely overwhelmed and kind of losing it and spiraling down with it, then maybe you've taken it further than you should right now.
Right now,
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
You could, so it's possible in stages to develop that.
Yeah. You go to the extent of what feels not just comfortable, but you're going to have to push the edges a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But if you find that you're starting, it's become the papancha, the proliferation around it is becoming uncontrolled, then you kind of have to say, okay, that's enough. You have to go back and say, okay, I've gone as far as I wanted with this. I'm not quite ready to go the full 9 yards here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then just say, okay, that was good. Leave it there. Pick up something that's also skillful, but along the different lines.
That's very helpful.
Yeah.
I mean, it was relief, but it was still pretty vivid.
Yeah. So you have to constantly be using your wisdom faculty, your reflection, to know what's appropriate in any particular moment. Not to shut yourself off, but also not to let yourself be overwhelmed by the old habit, the old mind, where it's going to go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just have a comment. I found that very powerful. It was good.
Yeah. The second of those two, pleasant, both of them. Oh, okay. Yeah. It's, feeling tone is the basis for what we do that causes suffering,
Yes.
Seeking after the pleasant, avoiding the unpleasant equals dukkha. And knowing that and stopping the response, the automatic response, is the cessation of dukkha.
And just being able to kind of open to it, to at some point, and feel how it changed. Just with more space around you.
Yeah. And it's keeping that space that allows you to just be watchful of that constant change. Last question. Nope, you're okay. You got under the wire. You got 1 minute.
Sorry. Could you talk a little bit more about the sutta that you mentioned, where unpleasant sensations when known are pleasant?
Yeah, the
For me, it's
chula.
I'm glad I know the unpleasant sensation. I mean, the mutual sensation when known is
Right.
pleasant. That was a little hard for me to understand, because on the other hand, it feels better to be clear than unclear. But then again, what you're being clear about isn't that pleasant. For me, at least, the mutual sensation when known, it doesn't feel. I mean, maybe I'm missing.
Yeah, no. By its own, quality. That there's some arguments that say there's really not such thing as completely neutral experience. That it's going to either be a little bit pleasant or a little bit unpleasant. But Nevertheless, it's, that's kind of splitting hairs probably. But with basic neutral experience, it's just that quality of not being aware of it that in itself is a slightly unpleasant experience, just because unknowing, ignorance of what's happening is the quality, the feeling tone quality of ignorance is unpleasant. The feeling tone quality of knowing, even a neutral sensation, just that ability to see clearly, sampajanya, has a slightly pleasant tone to it. So you're not trying to say that the actual sensation or feeling, the contact, the sensory contact itself turns into something that's pleasant or unpleasant, but that the quality itself of knowing and of not knowing.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that's in the Majjhima 44, Chula Vedala.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay. Well, then we'll call it a day, and sadhu, sadhu, sadhu to everybody for being here and coming and practicing together. Yeah. And for those who wish and want to stay, we'll have tea over in the hall. I'll be over there in a few minutes, so it's an early tea time. I assume that there might be something available in the kitchen for people, and over in the monks' room for us. So enjoy the rest of the day. And it's a double header. Today's Saturday night. If you're still just hungry for more, good kind of hunger, good kind of craving for Dhamma, Ajahn is going to give a few reflections tonight. Probably not a huge amount of Tudong stories, because he wants to save that for a one-pra night when there's more of the monastics here. But for those of the monastics who will be coming down, and for those guests and visitors who are still here, he'll be giving a few reflections.